Welcome, folks, to this press conference today. Issue 1 has helped establish the National Council on Election Integrity, which is a bipartisan group of more than 40 government, political, and civic leaders who work to ensure every American's vote was counted this year and is still working to defend the legitimacy of the 2020 election. This is a bipartisan group. It's truly a 50-50 group. It includes former cabinet secretaries, former elected officials, retired military leaders, and civic leaders, and as I said, has an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. Since the beginning of October, the National Council on Election Integrity has spent more than $10 million on TV and digital ads highlighting the nation's ability to hold successful elections for more than 240 years and thanking voters and election officials for their participation in the elections. As many of you know, the Department of Homeland Security has declared that these elections were perhaps the most safe, secure, and transparent in the history of the country. We are gathered here today with 4 members of the National Council on Election Integrity, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, to talk about why yesterday's vote by the Electoral College should signal to all Americans that it's time to put country over party, accept the results of the presidential election, and stop spreading baseless claims and conspiracy theories about our election that only undermines our democracy. Joining me today are former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, a Democrat, former Congressman Carlos Curbelo, a Republican, former Congresswoman Donna a Democrat, and former Congresswoman Barbara Comstock, a Republican. So with that, I will turn it over to Tom Daschle.
Well, thank you, Nick. I know I speak for the entire council in thanking you and the impressive staff at Issue 1 for your leadership over these past months to do all that we can to ensure the integrity of this year's election. As you outlined, it's been quite successful. And I think the biggest reason why is that it has been completely bipartisan from the very beginning. And that's certainly evident again today. I'm very pleased to join my Republican and Democratic council colleagues for this event. It's been a rocky, turbulent, and troubling 6 weeks since the race was called. Yesterday was one of the most important milestones over the course of our American history when it comes to elections. The Electoral College has now met. The electors have cast their ballots to affirm the will of the American people. It's now time to move forward so that we can address the many challenges facing our country together, with pressing issues like the coronavirus pandemic, the economy facing this nation. We need to put the November elections behind us and get to work. What's great about America is our ability to have passionate political debates and hotly contested elections and always put the rule of law above politics. At our best, we put country over party when the campaign is over. That's what's required of all of us now, beginning with Congress when they convene in January. Congress should fulfill its role in our presidential election process by accepting the votes of the Electoral College on January 6th without politics or grandstanding. In that regard, I'm very pleased that today, Leader McConnell finally acknowledged for the first time that Joe Biden was officially the president-elect. With that, Nick, I'll turn it back to you.
Sorry, I just got to unmute here. There we go. Excellent. I want to remind people that there will be a Q&A at the end of this, but that folks are also welcome to put questions into the chat that my colleague Michael Beckel will field. So with that, we're over to Carlos Curbelo.
Thank you, Nick, and good morning, everyone. Typically, during this time of year, we reflect and we give thanks for all the blessings that we have. And certainly, even though this has been a tough year, I think when we look back at election 2020, we should be very grateful to election officials all across the country, Republicans, Democrats, those without any party affiliation. They facilitated 160 million Americans voting. More than 160 million Americans cast a ballot in elections this year. Extraordinary, given the challenges associated with this pandemic, and of course, a very hectic and a noisy campaign. So our gratitude to so many people. And what they did was produce a free, fair, and transparent election where there were no instances of massive or widespread fraud where rules and procedures were followed for the most part. And this has been acknowledged by people all across the political spectrum, including Trump officials like Bill Barr and CISA Director Chris Krebs. So our gratitude to so many men and women throughout the country who did their very best and did a very good job of making sure that we had yet another free, fair, and transparent election in this country, something we should never take for granted. Despite the vote of the Electoral College, there are still those spreading misinformation, being dishonest about what happened and what did not happen in election 2020. Those who are continuing to spread these lies are not attacking the Democratic Party. They're not attacking Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. They're attacking every American and our democracy. We live in a country where there's a lot of debate about the separation of church and state, right? Our government does not have a religion. The closest thing we have to something sacred in our government is our elections process. And those who attack the integrity of our elections process, of our elections results, despite the fact that numerous courts have examined lawsuits, complaints, and dismissed all of them. Despite that, there are still those who are threatening the integrity of our elections, working to undermine the American people's trust and confidence in our elections. Again, this doesn't hurt any one party. It hurts all of us. It weakens our democracy. And again, the strength and the health of our democracy is something we should never take for granted and that we should do everything to protect. That's why we have come together to highlight, to underline the truth, to put the facts out there. Again, there are Republicans and Democrats who make up this important council. And our goal was not to see any one candidate or any one party win, but it has been and continues to be to make sure that the integrity of our elections remains intact, that people can trust this process. And surely, after everything we've seen over the last few weeks, we know that they can. So again, our gratitude to so many elections officials, Republicans, Democrats, independents throughout the country who made it possible for so many Americans to vote, a record number, and who made sure that this election, that the results can be trusted and that we can now move on to the business of governing, while of course, always looking forward to the next national election, which will be in 2 years.
Great, thank you, Carlos. Donna?
Thank you very much and good morning. Thank you to my colleagues here today, but also to all of our colleagues across the National Council on Election Integrity that we came together across the political spectrum. Let's face it, our institutions, all of our institutions faced a tremendous stress test this year. And it's not that we didn't survive that. And in fact, you could argue that over the course of the cycle, as difficult as it was, we came through still flying the flag. But there's no doubt that had the election been any closer, that things could have gone a different way. And indeed, we could have had a constitutional crisis on our hands. And that's why we've come together to push back on attacks against on our elections and to defend the democratic process. You know, at the end of the day, voters decided this election. Voters decided this election as they have decided elections over a couple of hundred years. And it's not that we've never seen a crisis moment in our history before, but it always reminds us that our institutions are there to protect our democracy, but we have to defend those institutions. Ultimately, voters decided and they chose Joe Biden to be the next president-elect. and Kamala Harris to be the next vice president-elect. And as complicated as the process is, from 50 different state elections to form one national election, to certification in every state, to the role of the Electoral College, it's really just that simple to go through these processes. Voters select their elected leaders. Politicians don't get to decide which ballots to count and which ballots to reject. The voters get to decide. And so to further attacks on our democratic processes and elections officials really has to end. It's over. It's time for us to validate the hard work of elections officials across the country, state and local officials who are just doing their jobs across party lines in a nonpartisan fashion to ensure that every single vote was counted fairly and accurately this year. These are patriotic Americans. They're our neighbors and they're our friends, and they shouldn't have to fear for their safety because they're conducting an election according to our Constitution. They deserve our praise. And in fact, they've done what many thought was impossible this year. They administered a smooth election during a pandemic that has taken so many lives, 300,000 lives, over 300,000 lives of Americans, and to do it under tremendous pressure. And so we should all today, moving forward, we have to accept the election results, and we have to move on. We owe it to our fellow Americans, and we owe it to our Constitution.
Great. Thank you, Donna. Barbara.
Thank you. Good morning, and wonderful to be with you and my colleagues, and appreciate the opportunity to work with this council. And I point out, we all came together just late in the summer, early fall before the election. So we could have been sitting here saying similar things if the election had turned out differently. The point was to have a bipartisan group of people that would deal with the issues here and be supportive of our election system. So as we call on Congress to accept the election results, would like to talk about, what was the latest attack on this process, which was, last week, the Attorney General of Texas, with the support, unfortunately, of 17 other Republican attorneys general and House Republican and some House Republicans, filed a lawsuit to nullify the Electoral College votes in the swing states that President-elect Biden won. This was a breathtaking repudiation of the principle of federalism that so many of us Republicans have argued for since we were old enough to understand it. I am someone who worked on the judicial nominations and confirmations of Chief Justice Roberts, of Justice Alito, and supported all of President Trump's Supreme Court nominees and probably most of his federal judges. I wasn't involved in those, but I know many of them, including, for example, federal judge in Pennsylvania who also turned away the case. So I would point out you have very serious sort of Federalist Society Republican confirmed judges who turned away these cases again and again, I guess over 50 times now. Fortunately, the Supreme Court of the United States did reject this case summarily, and they didn't even really write much about it. Every candidate has the right to pursue legal challenges. I was also involved 20 years ago in the Bush v. Gore case in Florida when it was only one state, and it was actually very close there. But President Trump's legal team and his allies have filed more than 50 lawsuits with only one success, which was a small procedural matter affecting a handful of votes. Governor Chris Christie, who has been very closely involved with President Trump's campaign, has called out this legal team for many of the frivolous cases that they continue to bring. And I think the fact that there weren't a lot of the serious people who were involved in the 2000 Bush v. Gore case involved in this also speaks to the frivolous nature of many of these cases that were brought. They failed for lack of evidence, as was noted by numerous legal scholars, including dozens of cases heard before Republican appointed judges. So our democracy, I feel, is very resilient. We have been able to get through this process. And frankly, I'm actually encouraged that you've seen these judges that Republicans work so hard to get there, who interpret the law, don't try and make it, as we've always said. And I do see our system as resilient from this process. And I'm pleased that Leader McConnell also spoke on the Senate floor this morning to congratulate President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris. And I think this system, as troubling as this process, as troubling as it's been, and certainly many firsts that have gone on that certainly are not the norm, we have been resilient for it. I commend Attorney General Barr for publicly stating he didn't see systemic fraud. I think that is also the opinion of the FBI director, given that they have not confirmed any of these things either. And even the other members of the administration, as mentioned, also agreed with that. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here with my colleagues today. And I think we should celebrate that our system has prevailed.
Indeed.
Who's got it right?
Yeah, exactly. Michael, questions, and Michael, a question for you. Should everyone put their questions into the chat, or are you going to be able to tap on people through video?
Everyone who has a question should put it into the chat. We've got a couple that have come in already. So the first question that we have today for our esteemed members of the National Council on Election Integrity is from Ken Doyle, a reporter at Bloomberg Gov. Why did so many Republican state attorneys general and members of Congress support the Texas case to overturn the election results that was somewhat summarily dismissed by the Supreme Court? Does anybody want to take a stab at answering that one?
Look, the greatest motivating factor these days for members of Congress is fear of a primary challenge. And it's regrettable, but it's true. And it's true in both parties. Obviously, with the president being very popular among Republican primary voters, this threat is most acute in the Republican Party. So that's why most of those Republicans signed that amicus brief. I think it was a mistake. I think it was a short-sighted decision. I think in the years to come, the Republicans who signed that amicus brief will be asked why they thought it might be a good idea to cancel out thousands, if not millions, I don't know what the exact number is, of legally cast votes, why that would make sense. But if you're looking for an explanation, it's fear of a primary challenge. And it's very difficult to lead when you're motivated by fear.
And on the other sort of from the other spectrum, for those who didn't sign it, I think you see many people who will be Republican leaders in the future. I appreciate that Liz Cheney notably didn't sign it, that people like that we had all worked with, like Tom Cole, who actually, known since 2000 when we were dealing with Bush v. Gore, and many others. Obviously, there were dozens and dozens, of others who didn't sign it. Appreciate, again, what Attorney General Barr said, but you also had senators like Ben Sasse from the beginning kind of stand up and speak out about this. And you've also had conservative writers, at National Review and others who, I've known since the 90s, whether it was during Clinton impeachment or Bush v. Gore or a lot of the constitutional kind of issues that we tackled. I've been pleased to see those folks step up and say that this is wrong. And of course, again, the Supreme Court, all 6 of the justices that are on the Supreme Court were nominated by Republicans, 3 of them by President Trump, and not even 4 of them wanted to grant cert. None of them took this case at all seriously. So I think that's something that anyone, say, who's on the Judiciary Committee who signed this anyone who is a lawyer really needs to look seriously at this. And but I do think the leaders that you'll see coming forward will be those who did not sign.
Great.
Thank you so much for those answers. We also got a question that came in. So much of our democratic process is not just based on what's written into the law, but some of the unwritten norms that we've come to expect in our democracy. And what are the things that you think lawmakers should be doing to, recultivate those norms, or that average citizens should be doing to help restore those norms in our system?
Well, look, I don't think it's going to be easy, but I do think that there are, first of all, I think this National Council and what comes next will help to examine some of those norms and help to examine where we may need to make changes in statute that will allow us to conduct elections so that a much broader swath of the American public has confidence in the election. But I think one of the returns to norm is going to be not attacking people who volunteer their time to count votes, to examine those votes, and to process them. That is really well outside of the scope of any democracy where you're actually attacking the public servants who agree to perform the mechanics of conducting an election.
I think there are 4 qualities that are really essential as we consider this election and all future elections. The first is just a recognition of the importance of trust and tolerance, a willingness to accept the fact that we have divergent views and that we've got to have an opportunity to voice those views without retribution. To a certain extent, that happened this year, but I think we've got to do a lot better job going forward. The second is, I think there's a real appreciation of the importance of participation across the board. We saw remarkable participation, not only with the voter turnout, but with the volunteer turnout to ensure that that vote was counted. I am very impressed with the multitudes of people who stepped forward to fill the void that we thought might exist as a result of COVID, but that participation was absolutely critical. The third is, I would call it quality and just courage. A lot of public servants and a lot of these volunteers stood up to a lot of pressure to bend the rules, to change the rules, to ignore the rules. They didn't. And we ought to celebrate that fact, as Barbara noted this morning. So that too is very, very critical. And then finally, we can never underestimate the importance of respect for the rule of law. That is the foundation of this democratic republic. And the more we can show that respect, celebrate that respect, and ensure that respect, the sounder and the more certain we can be about the future of this great country.
And I would say, I think for those who are concerned about the voting process, I think you'll see a lot of states look at, how they can reform their process. And maybe look to Florida, for example, and Carlos may probably knows that better, but Florida's certainly been held up as a model because after Bush v. Gore, Governor Jeb Bush did go in and try and make changes so that they have a large volume of absentee voting. And I would point out to Republicans that we gained seats in Florida, as Carlos knows, and that it was very smooth, and we knew those numbers on election night. So it is frustrating for the states that didn't do things promptly, and some of those is because they hadn't made those fixes on the state level. So I would hope they go and look on how can they make this work smoothly in the future and make sure they have systems. If people think there are systems in place where there were problems, you need to fix that beforehand, because once somebody is in voting or the ballot is separated from an envelope, you can't go back and take that ballot out. My Barbara Comstock's ballot is not in an envelope somewhere, or it's not marked as mine because we have a secret ballot. So that's something that's often been forgotten in this, but there certainly are reforms that I think we should see state by state, particularly, you look at New York, the fact that it takes them so long to count their votes. Certainly that's a place, not that it mattered in this election in terms of who was going to win, but it certainly did take far too long, both in the primaries and in the general. So we can all agree to reforms, I think, going forward. We'll probably have some disagreements on it too.
Well, that's right, Barbara. And what I would say is that some of these unwritten rules should perhaps be written down because they have been challenged in an extraordinary way. Traditions should maybe become rules and regulations and laws, just because this year has taught us that we can't take it for granted. And to your point about Florida, after being the laughing stock of the nation 20 years ago, I would say that Florida was a model for elections in 2020, for conducting elections and publishing results. And one of the ironies is that mail voting, which was attacked by the president and other Republicans this year, was really developed and exploited in a legal sense of the word by Republicans here in Florida, who about 20 years ago started encouraging their voters to vote by mail. And that paid off for Republicans in a number of elections. So Florida demonstrated this year, yet again, that mail voting is safe and secure. And for a lot of people, the easiest and most convenient way of voting. And we should be making it as easy as possible for people to vote. Florida has its rules. Some people like our rules, some people don't, but certainly no state has the right to come in and change our rules. And again, the state was a model in terms of running an election and publishing results this year.
And I'll just say that this National Council on Election Integrity has been an extraordinary group and an extraordinary experience for issue one. And I think that these four sitting in front of you can confirm that the council is excited to move forward into 2021 and help advocate for common sense reforms when it comes to election integrity and election administration. So we will be working on this as we move forward. Michael, any other questions? If not, I think we're up against our time limit.
Yeah, that's right. That's all the questions that we've got, and really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you to our panelists for giving their time this morning, and to everyone who tuned in to be part of this call. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Happy holidays.
Thanks.
See ya. Thanks, folks.